A fire-engine-red Alfa Romeo Berlinetta speeds through the mountain roads of northern Italy. Behind the wheel sits a 33-year-old woman dressed in elegant clothing, her jewelry catching the April sunlight. She's not fleeing, she's racing toward danger. It's April 19th, 1945. The war in Europe is nearly over. The Allies are closing in from the south. German forces are in full retreat. Any sensible person with means and connections would be fleeing to safety. Clara Petacci is doing the opposite. She's leaving the relative security of Lake Garda and driving to Milan to join the most hunted man in Italy, her lover of over a decade, Benito Mussolini, the deposed dictator of Italy. Her family has begged her to escape with them to Franco's Spain, where they'll be safe. She has refused. In the car with her, she's packed 2 gold watches studded with diamonds and rubies, a pearl necklace, diamond rings, a gold locket containing a miniature portrait of Mussolini, and most telling of all, a gold box containing a rosary. She's also brought her best cardigans with pink buttons, 8 of her finest blouses, and 3 negligées, 1 black, 1 velvet trimmed with fur, and 1 in orange. She knows she's packing for her death. 9 days from now, Clara Petacci and Benito Mussolini will be executed by Italian partisans. Their bodies will be hung upside down from a metal girder in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, subjected to the rage of a mob that has suffered under fascist rule for over 2 decades. Photos of their corpses will be transmitted around the world, becoming some of the most iconic images of World War II. But this isn't just another story about how a dictator fell. This is the story of a woman whose obsession began when she was 14 years old, whose devotion never wavered through scandal and war, and who, when given the choice between life and death, chose to die beside the man she considered her destiny. To understand why Clara Petacci would drive toward her own execution, we need to go back to April 7, 1926, when she was just 14 years old. On that spring day, Benito Mussolini, then 42 years old, and at the height of his power as Italy's fascist dictator, was walking through Rome's Campidoglio after an official meeting. An Irish aristocrat named Violet Gibson, suffering from mental illness, stepped forward and fired a pistol at point-blank range. The bullet grazed Mussolini's nose and forehead. It was the narrowest of escapes. Had Gibson's aim been slightly different, Italian history, and world history, would have unfolded very differently. Instead, Mussolini appeared in public soon after, wearing a large white bandage covering most of his nose, projecting an image of courage and invincibility. All across Italy, church bells rang. Te Deums were sung in cathedrals. The nation had come close to losing its leader, and the fascist propaganda machine transformed the assassination attempt into proof of Mussolini's almost superhuman destiny. In a comfortable bourgeois home not far from St. Peter's Basilica, a teenage girl named Clara Petacci sang her own private Te Deums. Born on February 28, 1912, Clara was the middle child in a deeply religious and staunchly fascist family. Her father, Francesco Saverio Petacci, was a prominent physician who worked first for the papacy and later for Mussolini's government. Her older brother, Marcello, had been an active member of fascist youth groups since age 13, participating in what they called punitive expeditions against political opponents. Clara had been educated by nuns in primary school and spent her days playing the harp and piano, seemingly destined for the quiet life of a respectable Italian woman. But she had developed an intense fascination with Mussolini. She plastered his image over all her school books. She collected every photograph, every newspaper clipping, every piece of propaganda featuring Il Duce. When news of the assassination attempt reached her, 14-year-old Clara sat down and wrote a letter to Mussolini. Her words revealed the intensity of her devotion. "O Duce, why was I not with you? Could I not have strangled that murderous woman?" My super-great-grandfather, our life, our hope, our glory. Oh, my soul, why wasn't I with you? It wasn't the letter of a concerned citizen. It was the letter of someone who had elevated Mussolini to the status of a deity. She signed it and sent it off, never expecting a response. For 6 years, she heard nothing back. But her obsession never faded. If anything, it grew stronger. 6 years later, in April 1932, Clara Petacci, now 20 years old, was engaged to Riccardo Federici, a lieutenant in the Regia Aeronautica, Italy's Air Force. They had plans to marry in 1934. On the surface, Clara's life was following the expected path for a woman of her class and background. But inside, she still harbored her childhood infatuation with Mussolini. On a beautiful spring day, both Clara and Mussolini happened to visit the seaside resort of Ostia. Clara was with her family, traveling in their chauffeur-driven car. When she spotted Mussolini's vehicle, she couldn't contain herself. She bounded out of the car and rushed over to introduce herself to the dictator. Mussolini, now 49 years old, was gracious. Here was an attractive young woman, clearly enamored with him, offering the kind of adulation that he found irresistible. There's some dispute about what exactly happened in the immediate aftermath of this meeting, but we know for certain that it changed both their lives forever. According to Clara's own diary, a document that would later become the subject of legal battles and historical fascination, they entered into a clandestine relationship almost immediately. 3 days after their meeting at Ostia, Mussolini called Clara. Then he invited her to Palazzo Venezia, his headquarters in Rome, to read poetry to him. Soon they were talking constantly. Mussolini sometimes called her up to 12 times a day. Clara confessed in her diary that during periods when he didn't call, she would shake with emotion and worry that he was spending time with other women. Her devotion to Mussolini was absolute. She would write to him, "I want to be between your feet like a little unhappy cat and earn a caress now and again." She assured him repeatedly that she couldn't possibly live without him. But she was married, and Mussolini, notoriously promiscuous, had a wife, Rachele, 5 legitimate children, and at least 9 illegitimate children from 8 different women. He was juggling multiple mistresses simultaneously. In May 1938, he would boast to Clara, "I was with one woman at 8 in the morning, another at 9, and a third at 10. And after the last one, a Brazilian whose name I no longer remember, I went to lunch." Yet despite his countless affairs, Clara Petacci would become his most constant companion. Unlike the others, she wasn't interested in brief, passionate encounters or the material benefits that came with being Mussolini's lover. She wanted complete devotion, and she wanted to be his one true love. It was an impossible dream, but she pursued it with single-minded intensity. By 1936, Clara's marriage to Riccardo Federici had become intolerable, at least from her perspective. She claimed he slapped her on occasion and made both her and her family suffer. Whether this was true or an excuse to justify what she wanted to do anyway is unclear. What is clear is that Clara appealed repeatedly to Mussolini to intervene. Mussolini had Federici shipped off to a military post in Tokyo as air attaché. In the spring of 1936, Clara and Riccardo separated. She was now free to be with Mussolini, though their relationship had to remain officially secret. A private apartment was reserved for Clara at Palazzo Venezia, Mussolini's massive headquarters. She would visit him there regularly, and their encounters became part of her meticulous diary. She wrote about their lovemaking with startling frankness. "I hold him tightly, I kiss him, and we make love with such fury that his screams seem like those of a wounded beast." Mussolini wrote letters to Clara that revealed a possessive, almost threatening quality to his affection. "Be afraid of my love. It's like a cyclone. It's tremendous. It overwhelms everything. You must tremble." The affair became widely known, at least among those close to power. Members of the Petacci family, notably Clara's brother Marcello, were able to benefit financially and professionally through influence selling. They became wealthy and powerful, living in a 32-room modernist mansion called Villa Cameluccia in northern Rome, complete with tennis courts, swimming pool, and a chicken run. For Clara, though, it wasn't about the money or the luxury. In her own mind, she had achieved what she'd dreamed of since age 14. She had become the companion of the man she considered not just Italy's leader, but a figure of almost divine significance. For 7 years, Clara Petacci lived as Mussolini's mistress in a strange state of semi-secrecy. Everyone who mattered knew about the relationship, but it was never officially acknowledged. The fascist press never mentioned her name. She couldn't appear beside Mussolini at public functions. She existed in the shadows of power, present but invisible. That changed dramatically in the summer of 1943. By July 1943, the war had turned catastrophically against Italy. Mussolini had led his country into World War II in June 1940, convinced that he was joining the winning side. He dreamed of recreating the Roman Empire, of carving out Italian territories across the Mediterranean and North Africa. Instead, Italy's military proved woefully unprepared and outdated. The invasion of Greece had been a humiliation. The British Navy had devastated the Italian fleet at Taranto. In North Africa, Italian forces were routed again and again, requiring constant German intervention to prevent complete collapse. By 1943, Sicily had been invaded by Allied forces. Rome itself was being bombed. The Italian people, who had initially supported Mussolini's promises of greatness, were suffering under rationing, military losses, and the growing certainty that they had chosen the wrong side. On July 24, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council, Mussolini's own governing body, voted to remove him from power. The next day, King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested. After 21 years of dictatorial rule, Mussolini's reign was over. He was taken to various locations and eventually held under house arrest at a mountain resort in the Apennines. The new government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, immediately began negotiations with the Allies. And they did something else, too. They exposed Clara Petacci. In August 1943, newspapers serving the new government revealed Clara Petacci's relationship with Mussolini in explicit detail. They disclosed all the benefits she and her family had received. They painted her as a corrupting influence, a woman who had used her sexual hold over the dictator to enrich herself and her family. The press campaign was brutal and effective. It accomplished two things. First, it discredited Mussolini himself by showing him to be ruled by personal passions rather than national interests. Second, it made Clara Petacci a public figure and a symbol of fascism's moral decay. For Clara, it must have been a shocking reversal. She had spent 7 years maintaining secrecy, living in the shadows. Now suddenly her name and face were in every newspaper, but not as Mussolini's companion, as his corrupt mistress, blamed for helping lead Italy to ruin. The revelation also disgusted many in the old fascist guard. For men who had built their identities around notions of masculine strength and martial virtue, learning that their duce had been so devoted to a mistress and that he'd allowed her family to profit from their connection was humiliating. Mussolini's imprisonment didn't last long. On September 12, 1943, German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny executed a daring raid on the mountain resort where Mussolini was being held. In what became known as the Gran Sasso Raid, German paratroopers landed gliders on a mountainside, stormed the hotel, and rescued Mussolini without firing a shot. Adolf Hitler wasn't ready to lose his Italian ally. He installed Mussolini as the leader of the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state based in the town of Salò near Lake Garda in northern Italy. It was a pale shadow of Mussolini's former power. He controlled only the parts of Italy still under German occupation, and everyone understood he was dependent on German military support. As soon as Clara heard of Mussolini's rescue, she made her decision. She fled Rome and headed north to Gardone to be near him. She had no illusions about what this meant. The new government had exposed and humiliated her. Her reputation was destroyed. The only place she could go was to Mussolini's side. But when she arrived, she found that things had changed. The old fascist guard was disappointed in Mussolini. Some were even disgusted. The revelations about Clara had damaged Mussolini's image severely. Some party officials made it clear that they blamed her for his weaknesses. Mussolini himself was different too. The confident, vigorous dictator was gone. In his place was a man who seemed diminished, tired, increasingly pessimistic about the future. He was 60 years old, suffering from various ailments, and running a government that existed only because German troops propped it up. Yet Clara stayed. Over the next 20 months, from September 1943 to April 1945, she and Mussolini saw each other only occasionally. He was consumed with trying to maintain his republic, while German control slowly disintegrated. She lived in a villa not far from his headquarters, waiting for the opportunities when they could meet. They maintained an intense correspondence during this period. Letters full of jealousy, arguments, declarations of love, and mutual recrimination. Mussolini continued to see other women. Clara continued to demand his exclusive devotion. Both knew that their world was collapsing around them. By early 1945, the situation had become hopeless. The Allies had broken through the Gothic line, the Germans' last major defensive position in northern Italy. Partisan activity was intensifying across the region. Cities were falling one by one. In February 1945, Clara wrote to Mussolini, trying to inspire him. "Nothing has changed. You are two dictators struggling with the world." She was urging him to see himself as Hitler's equal once again, to summon the confidence and power of his earlier years. But it was fantasy, and perhaps she knew it. Which brings us back to April 19, 1945. Clara driving her red Alfa Romeo north from Lake Garda to Milan. Her parents begged her not to go. Her sister pleaded with her to flee to Spain with the family, where Franco's fascist government would protect them. They told her that joining Mussolini was suicide. Clara's response was simple. "It is my destiny to be with him." 18 days before her death, Clara's mother, Giuseppina, wrote one final letter to Mussolini, begging him to take care of her daughter. The letter contained a telling complaint that the Petacci family had been forced to live from your oxygen all these years. After Clara's affair had been exposed, after the family's reputation had been destroyed, they had nowhere else to turn. When Clara arrived in Milan on April 19th, Mussolini was based at the city's prefecture, trying to maintain some semblance of government control. But Milan was on the verge of falling. Partisan activity was increasing daily. Workers were staging strikes. Everyone could sense that the end was near. Mussolini and Clara had 6 days together before the final flight began. 6 days to know what they surely both realized: that there was no escape, no good ending to their story. On April 25, 1945, something happened that would seal both their fates. Cardinal Alfredo Ildefonso Schuster, the Archbishop of Milan, offered Mussolini one last chance to save his life. Cardinal Schuster was a complex figure in Italian history. He had initially been sympathetic to Mussolini's fascist government, seeing it as a force that could work with the Church to shape Italian society. But by the late 1930s, his views had evolved. When Italy introduced racial laws following Nazi Germany's example, Schuster openly condemned them as born of heresy. During the German occupation of Lombardy from 1943 to 1945, he helped protect Jews and other refugees fleeing persecution. By April 1945, Schuster's primary concern was preventing the destruction of Milan. He knew that if the city became a battlefield, thousands would die unnecessarily. He had already been working to negotiate with both the Germans and the partisans, trying to arrange for a peaceful transition of power. Schuster understood that Mussolini was the key. If Il Duce could be convinced to surrender, if an agreement could be reached that allowed him to hand over power without a final bloody battle, Milan might be spared. On April 25th, Schuster received word that Mussolini had requested to meet with him that afternoon at 4 p.m. The intermediary claimed that Il Duce was willing to sign an unconditional surrender. Schuster immediately arranged for representatives of the CLNAI, the Committee of National Liberation for Northern Italy, which coordinated partisan resistance, to join the meeting. He was offering himself as a mediator, using the moral authority of the Church to broker a peace that would save lives on all sides. At 3 p.m., 1 hour before Mussolini was scheduled to arrive, Schuster had his staff prepare a private room in the Archiepiscopal Palace. The room was entirely covered in red damask, an elegant setting for what Schuster hoped would be a historic negotiation. But Schuster did something else, too, something that revealed his deeper intention. He had a bedroom prepared in the palace. The plan, if Mussolini agreed to surrender, was for him to stay right there in the Archbishop's residence, under church protection, as a prisoner of war with all the guarantees provided by international law. Mussolini would be safe. The Allies would eventually take custody of him. He would face trial, certainly, but he would live. Mussolini arrived precisely at 4 p.m., accompanied by Marshal Rodolfo Graziani and other remaining members of his government. The partisan representatives arrived an hour late. During that hour, Schuster sat alone with Mussolini. He offered him a glass of Rosolio, a sweet liqueur. He gave him a copy of a book he had written about a saint's life, and he tried to preach humility to Il Duce. According to Schuster's later accounts, Mussolini appeared physically and morally destroyed. The cardinal wrote that Mussolini had a face so stricken that it gave the impression of a man almost stupefied by immense misfortune. Schuster urged Mussolini to make his peace with God and with his fellow man. He painted a picture of what could happen: a dignified surrender, protection under international law, an end to the bloodshed. He was offering Mussolini a way out that allowed him to save face while saving his life. When the partisan representatives finally arrived at 5 p.m., the negotiations began in earnest. But almost immediately, something went terribly wrong. The partisans revealed that the German SS command had already been negotiating a separate surrender with them. The Germans, without informing Mussolini, had begun arrangements for an unconditional capitulation. They were abandoning their Italian allies. When Mussolini learned this, he was furious. For all his talk of the Axis alliance, for all his professions of brotherhood with Nazi Germany, the Germans were betraying him at the final moment. They were arranging their own survival and leaving him to face the partisans alone. According to accounts of the meeting, Mussolini's reaction was explosive. The man who had seemed defeated and resigned suddenly erupted in rage. He stood up and announced that he would provide an answer to the surrender terms by 8 p.m. that evening. Then he stormed out of the palace. As he left the building, he was overheard saying bitterly, "You know what the cardinal told me? To repent my sins." It was exactly what Schuster had told him: to make peace with God, to show humility, to accept responsibility. But for Mussolini, it was unbearable. After 23 years of absolute power, after decades of being treated as almost divine by his followers, the suggestion that he should repent was an insult he couldn't accept. Mussolini never returned to give his answer by 8 p.m. Instead, he gathered what remained of his government and made a fateful decision. They would flee north. Clara Petacci had not been present at the cardinal's meeting. She had been waiting elsewhere in Milan, but when Mussolini left the palace, she joined him. From that moment on, their fates were inseparably intertwined. Years later, historians would debate what might have happened if Mussolini had accepted Schuster's offer. He would have been captured by the Allies, certainly. He might have faced trial at Nuremberg alongside other Axis leaders. He might have been imprisoned for the rest of his life. But he would have lived, and Clara Petacci, who had no political importance and who had committed no war crimes, would almost certainly have survived as well. Instead, at 8 p.m. on April 25th, Mussolini and Petacci, along with a convoy of remaining fascist officials, their families, and a small German escort, left Milan and headed north toward Lake Como and the Swiss border. Clara knew what this meant. She had grown up in a devout Catholic family. She understood the significance of Cardinal Schuster's offer and what it meant that Mussolini had refused it. In her luggage, along with her jewelry and her finest clothes, she had packed that gold box containing her rosary. She was preparing to meet her God. The countdown to death had begun. They had exactly 73 hours to live. The convoy that left Milan on the evening of April 25th was a strange collection of the desperate and the doomed. German military vehicles mixed with civilian cars carrying Italian fascist officials and their families. Everyone was fleeing, but no one had a clear destination. Officially, there was talk of making a last stand in the Valtellina, a valley in the Italian Alps where fascist loyalists supposedly waited to mount a final defense. It was called the Ridotto Alpino Repubblicano Plan. But few truly believed in it. The more realistic hope was reaching Switzerland and somehow gaining asylum in neutral territory. Clara Petacci traveled in her red Alfa Romeo Berlinetta, the sports car Mussolini had given her. Her brother Marcello came with his family. Mussolini rode in another vehicle, accompanied by German Lieutenant Fritz Berzer, who had been assigned to watch the former dictator day and night. The convoy made its way north through the night, following the western shore of Lake Como. These roads, which had once hosted elegant vacation villas for Italy's elite, were now escape routes for the defeated and desperate. According to some accounts, on April 26th, Mussolini and Petacci made several attempts to cross into Switzerland. The Swiss border was tantalizingly close, just a few kilometers away. Neutral Switzerland had sat out the entire war. It seemed like salvation. But the Swiss border guards had been given clear instructions. As the war neared its end, Switzerland had been overwhelmed with refugees, German officials, Italian fascists, all trying to escape the consequences of their actions. The Swiss government had decided it could not and would not accept any more. When Mussolini's group approached the border, they were turned away. There was bitter irony in this. Switzerland, which had maintained profitable relations with fascist Italy throughout the war, which had benefited from Italian trade and cooperation, now wanted nothing to do with the fallen dictator. With the Swiss route blocked, Mussolini's options narrowed dramatically. The partisan presence was increasing throughout the region. Roadblocks were being established on major routes. Radio communications between resistance units reported that high-value targets were attempting to flee through the Lake Como area. On April 27th, Mussolini's group encountered a German military convoy retreating northward toward Germany. It consisted of about 40 vehicles, trucks, armored cars, and other military transports carrying Luftwaffe personnel and German civilians evacuating northern Italy. Mussolini made a decision that he thought would save his life. He would disguise himself as a German soldier and join their convoy. The Germans, protected by their military status, would be allowed through partisan checkpoints. Hidden among them, Mussolini thought he could slip past the resistance fighters who were searching for Italian fascists. It was a plan born of desperation and one that revealed how far Il Duce had fallen. The man who had spent decades crafting his image, who had posed for countless photographs in elaborate uniforms, who had projected strength and authority as the essence of his leadership, was now hiding his identity beneath a German Luftwaffe greatcoat and helmet. Clara Petacci faced a choice at this point. She could have separated from Mussolini. As a woman with no official government position, she might have had a chance of passing through checkpoints unmolested. Several people urged her to take a different route, to try to escape independently. She refused. Her destiny, she said, was irrevocably linked with Mussolini's. They would stay together, whatever came next. The German convoy made its way north along the narrow, winding roads that hugged Lake Como's shoreline. These were dangerous passages, the lake on one side, steep mountains on the other, with limited places to turn around or escape. Any roadblock would be difficult to avoid. At approximately 7 a.m. on the morning of April 27th, the convoy entered a short tunnel just north of the hamlet of Musso. On the other side of the tunnel, they found their path blocked by rocks and a felled tree. Partisan fighters appeared on the hillsides, their rifles aimed at the vehicles. The convoy had no choice but to stop. The checkpoint was manned by members of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, a communist partisan unit led by Pierluigi Bellini delle Stelle and Urbano Lazzaro. They had been named after Giuseppe Garibaldi, the 19th-century hero of Italian unification, and they saw themselves as continuing his tradition of liberating Italy from foreign domination. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, factory workers, and students, ordinary Italians who had taken up arms against fascism. Many had lost family members to fascist violence. Some had been imprisoned or tortured by Mussolini's secret police. When the partisan leaders approached the convoy, they initially prepared to wave it through. German military vehicles were still common along these routes. But something aroused their suspicion. The partisan commander, Urbano Lazzaro, noticed that several of the supposed German soldiers seemed nervous. Their uniforms didn't fit properly. Some appeared to be sweating despite the cool mountain air. He ordered a more thorough inspection. As the partisans began checking documents and examining faces more closely, the tension became unbearable. The genuine German officers maintained their composure, producing proper documentation. But the disguised Italians struggled to maintain their charade. Then came the moment that would seal everyone's fate. One of the partisans, a man named Giuseppe Negri, peered into a truck and saw a face that had been plastered on propaganda posters throughout Italy for over 20 years. Despite the oversized German helmet, despite the Luftwaffe greatcoat, despite the hunched posture, the distinctive jaw and the penetrating eyes were unmistakable. Mussolini's face was one of the most recognizable in the world. For 2 decades, the fascist propaganda machine had ensured that every Italian knew what Il Duce looked like. His image had been in every classroom, every public building, every newspaper. That propaganda, which had once been the foundation of his power, had now become his death sentence. Negri whispered urgently to his comrades. The word spread through the partisan fighters like electricity. Il Duce. It's Mussolini. When Lazzaro himself looked into the truck and confirmed the identification, he would later describe what he saw. His face was like wax, and his stare glassy, but somehow blind. Mussolini, realizing his disguise had failed, attempted one final effort to reclaim his authority. He straightened his shoulders and tried to assume the commanding bearing that had once made him the most powerful man in Italy. But it was useless. The partisans surrounded the vehicle and ordered everyone out. Clara Petacci had been traveling in a different vehicle. When the convoy was stopped, she could have remained silent. She could have claimed to be just another German civilian evacuee. Her face wasn't as famous as Mussolini's, but when she learned that Mussolini had been identified, she made her presence known. She insisted on being with him. The partisans, conducting a thorough search of the convoy, soon identified her as well. Her presence confirmed what they had suspected. They had captured not just the former dictator, but his inner circle and the woman who had shared his final years in power. In all, the partisans found over 50 Italian fascists hidden in the German convoy. The German officers, meanwhile, quickly distanced themselves from their Italian passengers. His quick abandonment demonstrated the complete breakdown of Axis solidarity in the war's final phase. The partisans faced a decision. They had captured Mussolini, but they were a small unit in a remote location. Other German forces were still operating in the area. Fascist loyalists might attempt a rescue, and Allied forces were advancing rapidly through the region. If the Allies took custody of Mussolini, the Italian resistance would lose the opportunity to deliver their own justice. As evening fell on April 27th, Mussolini and Petacci were taken to a small farmhouse in the village of Bonzanigo near Dongo. The building belonged to the De Maria family, local peasants who had no love for fascism. It was a modest structure with rough stone walls and basic furnishings, a stark contrast to the palaces they had occupied during the years of power. For Clara especially, who had grown up in privilege and spent nearly a decade enjoying the benefits of being Il Duce's companion, this peasant dwelling must have felt like a different world. The partisans stationed guards outside with orders to watch the prisoners constantly. This would be Mussolini and Petacci's last night together, and according to the partisan guards who watched them, it revealed the complex dynamic between them even in the face of death. Mussolini's behavior alternated between desperate attempts at dignity and moments of visible terror. He tried to engage his captors in conversation, sometimes appealing to their sense of Italian nationalism. He reminded them of territorial gains Italy had achieved under his leadership, of infrastructure projects that had modernized the country. At other times, he attempted to negotiate for his life. He offered information about hidden fascist gold reserves. He promised to reveal the locations of other fleeing officials if they would guarantee his safety. The partisans remained unmoved. Many of them had lost family members in the war. Others had witnessed brutal reprisals against civilian populations. Clara's presence complicated the situation. Unlike Mussolini, she had never held political power. She had never given orders that resulted in deaths or suffering. Some of the partisans debated what to do with her. There were arguments that she was merely a victim of circumstance. Others insisted that her years as Mussolini's companion made her complicit in his crimes. Throughout the night, Clara tried to comfort Mussolini while struggling with her own fear. According to accounts from the guards, she was calmer than he was, more resigned to their fate. Perhaps the religious faith she had maintained throughout her life gave her some comfort. Or perhaps, having chosen to join him knowing it would likely mean death, she had already accepted the inevitable. They talked through much of the night. What they said to each other, no one recorded in detail. We know that Mussolini mentioned his children repeatedly, expressing concern about their safety and their future. The personal toll of his political choices seemed to weigh heavily on him in those final hours. While Mussolini and Petacci spent their last night in the farmhouse, urgent communications flowed between partisan commanders throughout the region. According to the armistice agreements, Mussolini was supposed to be captured alive and handed over to the Allies. But many in the partisan leadership were unwilling to let that happen. They feared that Allied custody would mean Mussolini would face an international tribunal, possibly receiving a lengthy prison sentence rather than execution. During the night of April 27th, members of the CLNAI made an informal decision. They would dispatch a group of partisans to Dongo on a secret mission to execute Mussolini before the Allies could take custody of him. The man selected to carry out the execution was Walter Audizio, a communist partisan commander who used the nom de guerre Colonel Valerio. Audizio had fought against fascism since the early days of the resistance. He had lost friends and comrades to the regime's brutal repression. As dawn approached on April 28th, Mussolini seemed to sense that his time was running out. According to the partisans who guarded him that night, he spoke frequently about his legacy. Sometimes he was defiant, insisting that history would vindicate his attempts to restore Italy's greatness. At other times, he displayed something approaching regret, particularly when discussing the human cost of the war. Clara listened, occasionally offering comfort, occasionally crying quietly. She had packed her rosary, and perhaps she prayed. She had spent her entire adult life devoted to this man, and now she would die with him. Whether she regretted her choices, we'll never know. The historical record contains no indication that she expressed anything other than love and loyalty to Mussolini until the very end. As the sun rose on April 28th, both prisoners must have known that this was their last day. At approximately 11 a.m., Walter Audisio arrived at the farmhouse with a small team of partisans. When Audisio entered the room where Mussolini and Petacci were being held, the former dictator seemed to understand immediately what was happening. The partisan commander was direct in his communication. He informed Mussolini that he had been condemned to death by the National Liberation Committee for his crimes against the Italian people. Mussolini's reaction was one of shock, followed by a desperate final attempt to negotiate. He offered information about hidden fascist gold reserves. He promised to reveal the locations of other fleeing officials. He pleaded for his life in terms that would have been unthinkable just days earlier when he still held power. But Audisio was unmoved. Clara Petacci's fate had also been sealed by association. Despite having no official political role, her presence with Mussolini and her symbolic importance as his companion made her, in the partisan view, complicit in the regime's crimes. There is some controversy about what happened next. According to the official account given by Walter Audisio, Clara was to be executed alongside Mussolini as part of the planned operation. But according to other witnesses, Clara's execution was not part of the original plan. According to this version, as the partisans prepared to shoot Mussolini, Clara threw herself in front of him, attempting to shield him with her body. She shouted at the executioners, begging them to spare him. In doing so, she made herself part of the target. We'll never know with certainty which version is true. After the war, Clara's family brought civil and criminal court cases against Walter Audisio for her killing. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, finally being closed in 1967 when an investigating judge acquitted Audisio on the grounds that the actions occurred as an act of war. What we do know for certain is that Clara Petacci, given multiple opportunities over many days to separate from Mussolini and seek safety, had refused every single one. Whether she literally threw herself in front of bullets, or whether she was always intended to die alongside him, the symbolic truth remains the same. Clara Petacci chose death with Mussolini. Over life without him, Audisio and his men loaded their prisoners into a vehicle and began the short journey to Villa Belmonte in the small commune of Giulino di Mezzegra. The drive took only minutes, but represented the final transition from Mussolini's desperate flight to his ultimate reckoning. At approximately 4:10 p.m. on April 28, 1945, the vehicle arrived at Villa Belmonte. The partisans ordered the prisoners out and positioned them in front of the villa's iron gate. The setting was almost mundane, an ordinary suburban street with modest homes and well-maintained gardens, Mussolini's. Behavior in these final moments was described by witnesses as alternating between defiance and resignation. He attempted to maintain some semblance of dignity, standing as straight as possible and trying to project an air of composure. But those who observed him noted the tremor in his hands and the fear that was unmistakable in his eyes. There are multiple, contradictory accounts of Mussolini's last words. According to a May 1945 report in Time magazine, his final words were simply, "No, no." Other witness accounts claim he told his executioners, "Aim at my heart," or "Shoot me in the chest." Yet another account states that his last words were, "Let me save my life, and I will give you an empire." What no one disputes is what happened next. Audisio raised his weapon, a submachine gun he had borrowed from partisan Michel Moretti after his own gun jammed. He fired multiple shots at close range. Both Mussolini and Petacci fell immediately. The man who had dominated Italian politics for over 2 decades was dead within seconds. The woman who had loved him since she was 14 years old died beside him. There were no grand final words, no dramatic gestures, and no ceremony. Just the abrupt end of 2 lives that had shaped the destiny of millions. Audisio quickly verified that both were dead, then ordered his men to load the bodies into the vehicle. The plan was to transport them to Milan, where they would be displayed publicly as proof that the fascist regime had finally ended. During the journey, other high-ranking fascist officials who had been captured at various points were also executed. In all, 16 of Mussolini's top associates were killed that day. Clara's brother, Marcello Petacci, was also killed in Dongo, along with 15 others. As the partisan convoy approached Milan, a decision was made about where to display the bodies. The location would not be random. It would be deeply, deliberately symbolic. On August 10, 1944, just 8 months before Mussolini's death, fascist forces had rounded up 15 suspected anti-fascist partisans in Milan's Piazzale Loreto. With German SS soldiers looking on, they had executed them. The bodies were left to lie in the sun for an entire day as a warning intended to intimidate the population. From that moment onward, the resistance had called this place the Square of the 15 Martyrs. The choice to bring Mussolini's body to Piazzale Loreto was, as historian Giovanni de Luna later explained, nothing more than the application of the law of an eye for an eye. The square that had witnessed fascist brutality would now witness the reversal of power. In the pre-dawn hours of April 29th, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and the 16 executed fascists were dumped on the ground in Piazzale Loreto. As the sun rose, word spread rapidly through Milan's neighborhoods. Crowds began gathering in the square as soon as the bodies appeared. By mid-morning, thousands of Milanese residents had converged on Piazzale Loreto. They came from every segment of Italian society that had opposed or suffered under Mussolini's rule. Workers who had been exploited, families who had lost sons in pointless wars, women who had been widowed, people who had lived under surveillance and repression. The scene was chaotic and emotionally charged. People pushed forward to get a closer look, many unable to believe that the dictator was truly dead. Some spat on the corpses, others kicked them. Many simply stared in stunned silence at the physical proof that fascism in Italy had finally ended. The display served multiple purposes beyond simple revenge. For the partisan movement, it provided unmistakable evidence that they had succeeded in their primary mission. For ordinary Italians, it offered a form of psychological liberation, allowing them to see with their own eyes that the man they had been taught to fear and revere was nothing more than a mortal human being. The crowd's behavior reflected the complex emotions that Mussolini had inspired throughout his career. One woman emptied a pistol into Mussolini's body and screamed, "5 shots for my 5 murdered sons." Others cried out that he had died too quickly, that he should have suffered more. But the hate of many was wordless. They could only spit. According to the contemporary Time magazine report, Mussolini's corpse showed brutal evidence of the mob's rage. A bullet had pierced his skull over the left eye and emerged at the back, leaving a hole from which the brains dripped. His upper teeth protruded grotesquely. He wore a fascist militia uniform with muddy black riding boots. Clara Petacci lay beside him, wearing a white silk blouse. In her breast were 2 bullet holes ringed by dark circles of dried blood. She had been 33 years old. The mob surged and swayed around the grisly spot. International journalists who witnessed the scene described it as one of the most dramatic endings to any dictatorship in modern history. The images captured that day would be transmitted around the world, providing visual confirmation that another of the Axis powers' leaders had met his end. By late afternoon on April 29th, Allied military authorities intervened to end the public display. The bodies were removed, and a strange new chapter in the story began, one that would last for over a decade. Mussolini's body was eventually buried in an unmarked grave to prevent it from becoming a fascist shrine. But in 1946, his corpse was stolen by neo-fascist supporters. For months, the body's location remained unknown. It had disappeared into a bizarre underground network of fascist loyalists who refused to accept that their era had ended. The body was finally recovered and, remarkably, spent the next 11 years hidden in a cupboard of a Capuchin monastery. The monks kept this secret, perhaps out of a sense of Christian duty to care for the dead, regardless of who they had been in life. In 1957, newly elected Prime Minister Oddone Zoli found himself in a political predicament. He needed the support of a far-right party to maintain his coalition government. In return for their votes, he agreed to deliver Mussolini's remains to his widow. Rachele, after 11 years in the monastery cupboard, Mussolini's body finally received a burial in the family crypt in his birthplace of Predappio. The site has become a pilgrimage destination for neo-fascists from around the world, a fact that continues to trouble many Italians who remember the suffering fascism brought to their country. But the story has one more bizarre twist. In 1966, the United States government handed over a sample of Mussolini's brain that had been removed at autopsy and stored at St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Hospital in Washington, D.C. since 1945. The sample had been tested, inconclusively for syphilis. Mussolini's widow placed it in a box in his tomb. Finally, after 19 years, Benito Mussolini's mortal and restless remains were complete. Cardinal Schuster, who had tried so desperately to save Mussolini's life and prevent bloodshed in Milan, witnessed the scenes in Piazzale, Loreto on April 29th with sorrow. When informed that the bodies had been hung in the square, he told the prefect that he himself, wearing his cardinal's purple, would bless the bodies because you must have respect for any cadaver. Even in death, even for a man who had refused his offer of mercy, Schuster maintained his Christian principles. The cardinal died in 1954 and was beatified by the Catholic Church in 1996, recognized for his courageous opposition to fascist racial laws and his efforts to protect persecuted people during the war. Clara Petacci's family never recovered from her death. Her parents had warned her. Her sister had begged her to flee. But Clara had made her choice, and it cost her everything. In the years after the war, her family fought legal battles to clear her name and to hold someone accountable for what they considered her murder. But the courts eventually ruled that her death occurred in the context of war, and no one would be held responsible. Today, visitors can still see the spot in Giulino di Mezzagra where Clara Petacci and Benito Mussolini were executed. A modest memorial marks the location. Some come out of historical curiosity. Others come to pay respects, though to which figure is often unclear. The site serves as a reminder of how individual choices in extraordinary times can lead to extraordinary consequences. Clara Petacci made her choice at age 14 when she wrote that letter to Mussolini after the assassination attempt. She could not have known that this childhood infatuation would consume her entire adult life and ultimately end it. She made her choice again at age 20 when she met Mussolini at Ostia and pursued a relationship with him despite being engaged to another man. She made her choice when she left her husband to be Mussolini's mistress. She made her choice when the fascist regime fell and she fled north to join him in his puppet republic. She made her choice on April 19, 1945, when she drove her red Alfa Romeo to Milan instead of escaping to Spain. And she made her final choice on April 27th when she identified herself to the partisans instead of remaining silent. Each of these decisions narrowed her options until finally there was only one path left. The path that led to Villa Belmonte and the executioner's gun. Was it love? Obsession? Destiny, as she believed? Or simply the inability to imagine a life separate from the man who had defined her existence since childhood? Perhaps it was all of these things. Clara Petacci spent 19 years devoted to Benito Mussolini. She gave him her youth, her reputation, her family's future, and ultimately her life. In return, she got exactly what she had always wanted, to be remembered forever as the woman who stood beside Il Duce. Her name is now inseparable from his in history, just as their bodies hung side by side in Piazzale, Loreto on that April morning in 1945. The story of Clara Petacci and Benito Mussolini's final hours is ultimately a story about the nature of devotion, taken to its extreme conclusion. It's about how personal obsession can blind someone to reality, how love, or what passes for love, can lead someone to embrace their own destruction. It's about the choices we make, and how those choices define not just how we live, but how we die and how we're remembered. Clara Petacci chose to die with Mussolini. In doing so, she became one of the most famous women in Italian history, though not in the way she had once dreamed when, as a 14-year-old girl, she plastered his photos across her school books and imagined a future where she would be important, where she would matter, where she would be close to greatness. She got her wish, but the cost was everything. Word count, approximately 9,200 words, suitable for a 60-minute documentary at normal speaking pace. The photographs taken in Piazzale, Loreto, on April 29, 1945, remain some of the most powerful images of the 20th century. They show not just the end of two lives, but the end of an era. They capture a moment when ordinary people reclaimed their power from a dictator who had ruled through fear and propaganda. And they show Clara Petacci, whose face had once been carefully hidden from public view, now exposed to the world in the most brutal way imaginable. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of love, loyalty, and complicity. Can devotion to a person make you complicit in their crimes, even if you never held power yourself? Is there nobility in choosing to die with someone you love? Or is it simply the ultimate act of enabling destructive behavior? These questions have no easy answers, which is perhaps why Clara Petacci's story continues to fascinate decades after her death. She was not a political leader. She made no policy decisions. She gave no orders that sent soldiers to war or civilians to prison camps. Yet her association with Mussolini made her inseparable from his legacy. In the eyes of the partisans who executed her, in the eyes of the mob that desecrated her body, and in the judgment of history, she was guilty by association. Her family's attempts to separate her story from Mussolini's, to present her as an innocent victim caught up in events beyond her control, ultimately failed. The courts may have eventually acquitted her executioner, but history has rendered its own verdict. Clara Petacci chose her path, and that choice had consequences. Today, Italy continues to grapple with the legacy of fascism. Predoppio, Mussolini's birthplace where his body now lies, sees thousands of visitors each year. Some are historians and tourists. Others are neo-fascists who still revere Il Duce and everything he represented. The existence of this pilgrimage site troubles many Italians who remember the suffering fascism brought to their country. The debates about how to remember this period, whether to preserve sites associated with fascism for educational purposes or to eliminate them entirely, continue to this day. Clara Petacci has no such shrine. Her body was eventually buried with her family, far from the spotlight that she had once craved, and then learned to fear. She is remembered primarily through her association with Mussolini, which is perhaps exactly what she wanted. Even if the circumstances were nothing like she had imagined as a teenage girl writing love letters to a dictator. Her diaries, which were buried for safekeeping after her death and later became the subject of legal battles, provide an intimate window into the private life of one of history's most notorious dictators. They reveal a man who was insecure, jealous, boastful, and constantly torn between his public image and his private desires. But they also reveal Clara herself, not as a victim or a villain, but as a complex woman who made choices that seem incomprehensible to many of us today. The story of those final 24 hours, from the Cardinals' meeting on April 25th to the E.T. execution on April 28th to the display in Piazzale Loreto on April 29th, encapsulates one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in modern history. In less than 4 days, Mussolini went from having one final chance at survival to being a corpse hanging upside down in a public square. Clara Petacci went from being a woman who could have saved herself to being forever remembered as the mistress who died with her lover. The speed of their fall, the brutality of their end, and the public nature of their humiliation created a powerful symbol that resonated far beyond Italy's borders. It demonstrated that even the most entrenched dictatorships could be overthrown, that even the most powerful leaders were ultimately vulnerable, and that justice, however rough and imperfect, could be delivered by ordinary people rising up against tyranny. For Clara Petacci, personally, those final hours must have been a strange mixture of terror and vindication. She had been telling people for weeks that her destiny was tied to Mussolini's. She had refused every opportunity to escape, insisting that she would share whatever fate awaited him. In the end, she was proven right. Her destiny was indeed bound to his, all the way to the executioner's wall at Villa Belmonte. Whether she regretted her choices in those final moments, we'll never know. The guards who watched them that last night reported that she seemed calmer than Mussolini, more resigned to their fate. Perhaps her religious faith gave her peace. Perhaps her lifelong conviction that being with Mussolini was her destiny made death seem like the inevitable conclusion to her life story. Or perhaps she was simply exhausted after years of living in fear, scandal, and the shadow of a man whose power was built on violence and had now collapsed into chaos. The Alfa Romeo that Clara drove to Milan on April 19th, that beautiful red sports car that Mussolini had given her, tells its own story. In 2015, 70 years after her death, that car sold at auction in Paris for over €2 million. Someone paid that staggering sum to own a piece of this tragic history. The car represents Clara's last journey toward Mussolini, her final choice to embrace her destiny rather than escape it. It's now a museum piece, a relic of a woman whose devotion cost her everything. The rosary she packed in her luggage, the elegant clothing she brought for her final days, the jewelry she wore, all of these items represented both her past life of privilege and her preparation for death. She knew she was going to die, yet she packed carefully, as if the particulars mattered. Perhaps maintaining appearances was a form of control in a situation where she had none. Cardinal Schuster's attempted intervention on April 25th represents one of history's great what-ifs. If Mussolini had accepted the cardinal's offer of sanctuary, if he had agreed to surrender peacefully, if he had shown the humility that Schuster urged upon him, Clara Petacci would almost certainly have survived. She had committed no war crimes. She had held no political office. The Allies would have had no reason to prosecute her. She might have lived out her life in obscurity, perhaps writing memoirs, perhaps living quietly with her family. Instead, Mussolini's pride and rage at learning of the German betrayal led him to storm out of the archiepiscopal palace, taking Clara with him into the final desperate flight that could only end one way. The 52nd Garibaldi Brigade that captured them at the checkpoint near Dongo had no way of knowing that they were about to make history. They were just local resistance fighters doing their job, checking vehicles, looking for fascists trying to escape. When they recognized Mussolini despite his disguise, it must have seemed almost miraculous. The man whose face had been plastered across Italy for 2 decades, who had seemed almost superhuman in his ability to survive political crises and military disasters, was suddenly right there in front of them, hiding in a truck in an ill-fitting German uniform. The propaganda that had made him powerful had betrayed him at the crucial moment. His face was too famous, too recognizable, too thoroughly embedded in the Italian consciousness. He couldn't hide from his own image. The irony would have been obvious to everyone present. Mussolini had built his power through control of images, through photographs, posters, newsreels, public spectacles. He had understood better than most leaders of his era how to use media to create an aura of strength and inevitability. But in creating that omnipresent image, he had made escape impossible. The same propaganda tools that elevated him to power destroyed any chance he had of surviving its loss. Clara Petacci's decision to identify herself to the partisans when she could have remained anonymous is one of the most poignant moments in the entire story. She could have saved herself. Her face wasn't as famous as Mussolini's. She might have passed as just another refugee in the German convoy. But when she learned that Mussolini had been captured, she chose to join him. That choice tells us everything we need to know about her character and her devotion. The legal battles that followed her death, her family's attempts to prosecute Walter Audicio for her killing, the years of litigation, the eventual acquittal, all reflected the complicated question of Clara's guilt or innocence. Was she a war criminal who deserved execution? Was she an innocent civilian who was murdered? Was she somewhere in between, complicit through her association and support, even if she never directly ordered anyone's death? The courts eventually decided that the question was moot, that wartime rules applied, that revolutionary justice had its own logic. But the moral question remains unresolved. The transformation of Piazzale Loreto from a site of fascist brutality to a site of anti-fascist triumph was deeply symbolic. The same square that had displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans in August 1944 now displayed the bodies of Mussolini and his top officials in April 1945. The reversal was complete. The victims had become the victors, and the oppressors had become the punished. This kind of symbolic geography matters deeply in how societies process trauma and transition to new political systems. By choosing Piazzale Loreto specifically, the partisans were making a statement about justice and memory. They were saying that crimes would be remembered and answered in kind. The mob's behavior in Piazzale Loreto, the spitting, the kicking, the woman who emptied her pistol into Mussolini's corpse while screaming about her 5 murdered sons, was both understandable and disturbing. It reflected genuine suffering and rage that had been building for over 2 decades. These were people who had lived under dictatorship, who had lost loved ones to war and political violence, who had been denied freedom and dignity. Their fury was real and justified. Yet the scene also demonstrated how quickly justice can become vengeance, how the impulse to right wrongs can devolve into brutality. Cardinal Schuster's insistence on blessing the bodies, despite everything Mussolini represented, was a reminder that human dignity should survive even death. Clara Petacci's brother Marcello, who had profited so extensively from her relationship with Mussolini, was also executed on April 28th. The entire Petacci family paid the price for their association with power. Marcello had used his sister's position to enrich himself through influence peddling and corrupt business deals. He had reveled in the wealth and status that came from being Il Duce's mistress's brother. Like Clara, he had opportunities to escape. Like Clara, he chose to stay close to Mussolini. Unlike Clara, whose motivations seemed rooted in genuine devotion, Marcello's reasons were clearly financial and political. Yet both met the same fate. The partisans made no distinction between those who loved Mussolini and those who merely profited from proximity to him. The hidden history of Mussolini's body after death, the theft by neo-fascists, the years in the monastery cupboard, the political bargaining for its return, the brain sample from America all demonstrate how even in death, Mussolini remained a contested symbol. His physical remains became a political football, fought over by different factions with different visions of Italy's past and future. The fact that his tomb in Predappio has become a neo-fascist pilgrimage site shows that history is never truly settled, that old battles continue to be fought by new generations. The persistence of fascist nostalgia in Italy and elsewhere is a sobering reminder that the lessons of history are not automatically learned or retained. Clara Petacci's diaries, which survived her death and eventually became available to researchers, provide an invaluable window into the private world of power. They show us a Mussolini who was insecure, jealous, boastful about his sexual conquests, and often surprisingly vulnerable. They show us a Clara who was devoted but also demanding, who wanted exclusive love from a man incapable of providing it, who recorded every slight and every tender moment with equal detail. These diaries have been controversial since their discovery. Some see them as historical documents that deserve study, others see them as invasions of privacy that should have remained buried. But they undeniably add depth to our understanding of both figures. The question of what makes someone choose death over life, love over survival, destiny over escape, is ultimately unanswerable. Clara Petacci made that choice, but her inner reasoning remained opaque even to those closest to her. We can analyze her psychology, her religious beliefs, her family dynamics, her life experiences. We can try to understand how a 14-year-old's crush on a dictator evolved into a devotion strong enough to embrace death. But in the end, some human choices defy complete explanation. They remain mysterious, troubling, fascinating. What we can say with certainty is that Clara Petacci's story matters because it reveals something important about power, devotion, and the human cost of political extremism. She was not a major historical figure in her own right. She made no great speeches, commanded no armies, shaped no policies. Yet her life and death illuminate the personal dimensions of dictatorship in ways that political analysis alone cannot. She reminds us that behind every tyrant are people who enable them, support them, love them, and ultimately share their fate. Her story is a warning about the dangers of blind devotion, about the costs of associating yourself with destructive power, about the impossibility of separating your fate from the fate of those you choose to stand beside. In the end, Clara Petacci got exactly what she said she wanted. Her destiny was bound to Mussolini's. They died together, were displayed together, and are remembered together. For a woman who spent years in the shadows, whose relationship had to remain secret, who was exposed and humiliated when that secret became public, there is perhaps a bitter satisfaction in knowing that history has granted her what she always sought: a place beside Il Duce, recognized and remembered, their names forever linked. The price was her life. Whether that price was worth paying is a question only she could answer, and she took that answer with her to her grave.